Hello and welcome to the Chris Ye podcast. This is, as always, Chris Ye, and I am joined today by my partner in crime, Eli Schwartz. Eli, go ahead and say hello.
Hey, great to be here with you again doing this.
So Eli and I have been asking the question, what should we do in response to this COVID-19 pandemic? And certainly, obviously, we've all done a lot of things to change our lives, try to slow down the advance of the virus. But I know that I'm of the firm belief that eventually medical science will prevail. We will get past this. And the big question is, how do we then play the rebound? How do we be realistically optimistic about what's going to happen from here? And to discuss this question, Eli and I are joined today by a very special guest, Allen Lau, who is the CEO and founder of WattPad, an incredible Canadian company that is apparently doing extremely well. So Eli and I are going to have a great conversation with Allen, and hopefully this will give you some great insights that you can then apply to your own business. So Allen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
So tell us a little bit about WattPad. What do people need to know about WattPad, the business model, and where it came from?
Yeah, so if people, or when people ask me what is WattPad, this would be my answer. WattPad is a global multi-platform entertainment company. We have an app that lets people discover and share stories. Stories mainly fictional stories from science fiction to romance and everything in between. We have over 80 million monthly users using the app, of which about 4 million are writers, and they share more than 500,000 new chapters on our platform every day in 50 languages around the world. And because of that, we collect a lot of data and content, and leveraging the data and content, especially leveraging machine learning, we are able to derive a lot of data and insights from what we collect. And based on that, we can pick the top IPs, the content IPs, and then turn them into TV shows and movies and print books and other forms through partnerships. And some of them we do it ourselves. We have a separate division called WattPad Studios to focus on that. So in a nutshell, that's what we do.
That's incredible. So you essentially have the list on that to know what's going to work and what isn't.
Right. I don't want to take anything away from human. Human is a big part of it. However, with this much content, 500,000 new chapters every day, and by the way, I did the calculation. If I print them on paper every 1 or 2 weeks, we would create one new Mount Everest. So it's a lot of data. A lot of content. With that much content, utilizing technology to find the gems in this gigantic haystack is almost a necessity. So that's why we invested quite heavily many years ago, started investing in machine learning and data to help us find the gems in the mountain of stories.
And when I think about like this pandemic, so much has been made of people turning to Netflix and other streaming services. Where are some of the places where WattPad stories have shown up? Like if somebody hears this interview and says, I want to watch something or read something or listen to something, in addition to WattPad, where should they look?
In addition to WattPad, as we all know, we are spending more time at home. Very clearly, when you're at home, you spend more time on digital media, whether it's video, audio, and or reading material. That's pretty obvious, and I think everyone is seeing that now. What's so interesting is that people are also craving for social. That's also obvious because we miss that day-to-day interaction with other humans. We are, by design, a social creature. We are missing that. And what we have seen on our platform, because WattPad is not just a place for people to read and write content, it's also a community. We see hundreds of millions of messages every month. And what we've seen is there's a step function growth in the number of comments and messages on our platform. I would even say over-index on the increase of time spent in the platform during the lockdown. So I guess to answer your question, in addition to Netflix or audio or other forms of entertainment, I think people are actually spending more time online interacting with other people, as we have seen, at least on our platform as well.
Well, that's fantastic, because it sounds like, well, of course, this pandemic is a terrible thing. It's actually increased the usage of WattPad. It's a business that has actually improved during this time.
Yeah, absolutely. We, as we all know, around mid-March, pretty much within a week, the G20 countries, one by one, within a few days, every single one locked down. And when I look at the numbers, each one followed the same pattern. Starting with Italy, they were one of the first that locked down, and then every single one afterwards followed the same pattern. But what's also interesting is as we start to see some of the countries, I would say most of the countries are starting to reopen, and some of the countries are already fully reopened. The numbers, they don't drop that, they drop a bit, but for the most part, they sustain at a higher level. That's a clear indication to me. The new normal is not going to be the same as the old normal. As people are spending more time, they are building new habits, and these new habits are going to stick around. As another example, many of our employees, including myself, because we cannot enjoy the nice coffee in the office anymore, people are buying nicer coffee machine at home. And after the lockdown, do you think you are going to stop using that machine? Probably not. So this is an indication of how habits has been forming in the past few weeks, and many of the new habits are going to stick around.
Well, that is a great example of one of the ways that people can play the rebound, which is to take advantage of this time to get more people to sample products, develop those habits, and in your case, interestingly enough, develop like a set of social connections around those interactions. So that is a great, great example of why this is going so well. But let's turn back the clock to the history of WattPad, because WattPad has actually been around for well over a decade now. I believe you founded it in 2006. What was the journey that led you to starting WattPad? Because you're a Canadian guy, you work for big companies like IBM and Symantec. Those things don't scream entrepreneur to me, but obviously you became a serial entrepreneur. What was it in your life that led you on the path to entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I think that part, I can keep talking for hours, but I'll keep a long story short. I did start my career at IBM, but I have to say that was in the 90s, and day one, at the end of the first day at my job, I knew, oh gosh, I don't believe I can last this long. So that was one mistake that I made, but just like any startup, it's okay to make mistakes, but you just have to pivot and correct that quickly, right? So within a few months, I joined a startup company called The Arena. At that time, probably no one knows about this company anymore, but when I joined, it was a startup, but 3 years later, when it was acquired by Symantec for $500 million, it grew to 700 people. So I was on a rocket ship. I was it was a tiny startup when I joined. I was sharing a desk with my fellow engineers. There were like 50 people in the company, or around that number at that time, but grew more than 10x in 3 years. So that experience, life-changing, because I knew was possible. I've seen it in front of my own eyes. So when the founders of The Arena, when they started venture capital slash incubator, I couldn't resist the temptation. I joined them, and that was when I joined them. It was March year 2000, and that's at the peak of the bubble, right? But interestingly, when this is one thing I learned through the few crises in the past 2 or 3 decades. Whenever there's whether it's bubble, whether it's financial crisis, it's always the best opportunity to start a new company because, like what we discussed, there should be and there would be new behavior coming out of these abrupt changes in the market. And that's when I started my first company. It's called Tira Wireless. So I'll skip that part. What Tira did was mostly pivoted into mobile gaming at that time, but I wasn't a gamer. So in the spare time, I tried to combine what I did professionally and my, I would say, passion in the evening, which is reading. So I built a mobile reading app on the Nokia, candy bar Nokia phone. That was year 2002. So when I did the prototype, clearly it's too early because I could only read 2 lines of text or 3 lines of text at a time. No one is going to use it. And even I couldn't convince myself I have to press the down arrow 1,000 times before I finish a chapter, just not impossible to use. So I parked that idea until year 2006, when the most popular phone at that time was the flip phone, the Motorola Razr, right? At that time, I could read 10 lines of text instead of 2 because of the larger screen size. So I thought, okay, perhaps it's the right time to restart this idea. And then out in the blue, now my WattPad co-founder, Ivan, but at that time, Ivan, he was living in Vancouver. So he instant messaged me out in the blue, hey, Alan, I'm working on a new product idea. Can you give me some feedback? And when I clicked on that link, guess what I saw? He was also working on a reading app for the flip phone. But he was one step ahead of me. He also built a website that people can freely share their writings. So as you can see, this is like the predecessor of WattPad. 2 days later, I flew to Vancouver and meet with him. And in a way, the rest is history. We started the company.
That's fantastic. Eli, why don't you take over and ask the next question?
So you founded the company in 2006. 2 years later, 2008, the world goes to hell in a handbasket with the recession. So we're in a little bit of a crisis now: recession, depression, pandemic, whatever we want to call it. So this is your second time around. Like, what are some things that you learned from the first time around? And I imagine you mentioned you're working in tech before, so you saw the .com bubble crash. You saw the recession in 2008. Now we've got 2020. What are some things you learned from the past ones? What are some things that are just similar now? What are some things? What's some advice you can give people on how to deal with this?
Yeah. So we started the company towards the end of 2006, and when we launched the kind of going out of beta, it was early 2007. And by that time, the world starting to enter the recession. Version 1 product, getting product market fits, especially this is like a double-sided marketplace when you think about this. As a supply side writer, demand side as reader, to kickstart that flywheel. It's actually very, very difficult because of the chicken and egg problem. Without any content, we don't have any readers. Without any readers, no one would have any incentive to upload the content. So it took a while for us to kickstart the flywheel. We were using some very interesting, perhaps now obvious idea, like using classic books to at least drive the supply side first, and then leverage the readers to attract new writers. But that took a long time, and we were inexperienced. Marketplace now, of course, as everybody knows, and the network effect. But even network effect, this term was fairly new at that time. So by the time we start to get traction, is already into 2008. So in a way, because of the lack of traction in the first year and a half, there's no worse time to fundraise for this company. What's worse than having the financial crisis is you have a product that's proven with no traction, right? So we kind of skipped that part. We kind of bootstrapped it for a year and for almost 3 years before we had some angel investors invested in a company. And the lack of funding, in a way, forced us to be super focused, super resourceful. And also we did a million things on the side to keep us going. But I think in a way, luck is also was also on our side. In the summer of 2008, guess what? A new product called the App Store came to the market, and then shortly after, Android came to the market. So when we built our first iPhone app, it was early 2009. It's a blue ocean, green field. We had the first mover advantage, and we did a million interesting things to drive the adoption. For example, because of the recession, people look for free books. So we actually changed the product from WattPad to 100,000 free books WattPad. So very search friendly. And at that time, this type of hacks could be super effective on the App Store. Now it's less effective now. You still have to do a little bit of App Store optimization, but nowhere near as effective as before. So we, through those techniques, we were able to become one of the top apps, at least under the book categories. And that's really helped us created the initial traction of the product.
And that's one of those lessons that I think is so important for entrepreneurs out there, which is you found ways to make WattPad useful in single player mode. Right? Before you ever had the readers to attract the writers and the writers to attract the readers, you're like, listen, we're going to attract the readers in. It's a recession. They're going to want free books, and we've got a way for them to read books for free. And once they're in, there's an audience for the writers. So that is a classic, very clever way to get around the cold start problem. Yeah. Obviously, WattPad has now become enormously successful. I think you mentioned that you're in how many different countries?
We support over 50 different languages. So practically all the key regions from the entire Europe to Latin America, Portuguese and Spanish, as well as the key languages in Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. We support them all.
So I guess the question would be, how does it differ from country to country, region to region? Obviously, those of us who are on this call right now are either American or Canadians. We're most familiar with those markets. But what have you had to do differently in order to serve so many markets? Or have you been able to serve them all with essentially the same approach?
To a degree, yes. But as we learn more about that market, we start to diverge. But one interesting hack that we did very early on, also in 2007 or 2008, was that we realized English may not be the first language that took off on the platform. We had no idea which one, but I guess may not be English, because even though English is probably the most common language on the planet. Only 400 million people are using English as their first language. That's 5% of the population, smaller than you may think. So because of that, the one hack that we did at the time was on the website, on the main page, we listed pretty much all the major languages, the top 10, started with the top 10 and then the top 20, from Spanish to Portuguese and English and French. We had them all. But the product actually functioned exactly the same. We just want to make sure the homepage is more welcoming. If you Google it, you find WattPad, you may want to stick around because you think we support your products, right? That was one of the most successful hacks that we have done that actually worked, because the first language that took off, guess what, is Vietnamese. I cannot speak Vietnamese. I've never been to the country. In fact, I don't even know a single Vietnamese friend. It just randomly took off. But after it took off, what we learned is we really have to understand what's going on in there. So we try to talk to the users. Hey, why are you using this? What type of content would be interesting to you? So we treat the product very subtly, depends on the language, depends on the culture, and more importantly, we interact with the users so that we understand the community behavior. I cannot tell you how important it is.
That's fascinating. So was it the network effect of like people in Vietnam are using it and they just tell other people, and do you just gain dominance in that country?
Yep. What we found is afterwards, after a couple of years, finally we had some users who would be telling us because if you're starting the company, Vietnamese, no offense to my friends in Vietnam, most people would not be thinking of that first, right? English always the first one, and then perhaps fixed French, Italian, German, and Spanish, that would be the second. Most companies would ignore Vietnam until you get to very large scale. But for them, when they see, hey, this is a new company and they support Vietnamese, all of a sudden they feel the connection. And that's that extra 5% of passion, extra 5% of love somehow kick quite a few people over the goal line. And once we have the content, and it just started a snowball.
So are you seeing any trends now that differ between various countries, whether they're in Southeast Asia or whether it's the US or Canada or Europe? Is everyone behaving the same during this pandemic?
In terms of usage, pretty much universal. The same amount increase in time spent across all the countries, give or take a few percentage points. Same amount of social behavior across all the countries. I don't see any drastic difference across different countries. But what I would say is sometimes what we do really well is surfacing local content written by local people, relevant to local culture. You may not be interested in a love story when people riding the jeepney in Manila, but people in Philippines, they love that, right? There's some very good examples that we use inside the company that we realize. We may think for us, I'm not sure you can speak Spanish or not, but I can't.
Un poquito.
Embarrassingly, I cannot, but Spanish is not a single language. Colombian Spanish is very, very different than Mexican Spanish, for example. But because of the size of both the population and economy, the in traditional publishing, the Spanish and Mexican Spanish, they dominate the market. So in a way, the voice of Colombian is being lost. I'm purely speaking from the written word perspective, but I can say the same thing perhaps for music and other types of entertainment. But what we have done is we enable the Colombian writers to write Colombian specific stories that's really resonating with the Colombian audience. And that type of niche community, I don't mean to say Colombian stories as a niche market, but in relative term, it is. And that because of that type of niche targeting and niche enablement for content creation, that allows a much deeper connection in the community.
And it really feels like this sense of belonging, which is what you're really talking about. People see themselves on the page and they're part of a community discussing the same stories with fellow fans. That sense of belonging seems to be the thing that drives that incredible stickiness and gets the communities to really adopt WattPad. And that is just really cool to see. Now, in preparation for this interview, you actually sent over a link to something that is a blog post of yours, but it actually began as an internal email. You emailed the company about the past disruptions that you've seen. We talked a little bit about them. And you said, crisis and market disruption always create new opportunities. Always. So what kinds of new opportunities have you seen so far, either for WattPad or in general? And what are some ones that you're still expecting to emerge that you feel like, hey, you know, someone should go after them?
Yeah, there are a few themes that I touched on briefly early on. I would say, I would perhaps summarize it into four themes. There are more for sure, but these four are more relevant to digital media or digital entertainment companies. Of course, healthcare is for sure there will be a lot of new opportunities, but outside is the context of what I'm about to talk about. So these four themes, I would say people are spending more time at home. And because of the increased time spent, perhaps the type of content that they entertain would be quite different. As an example, perhaps I'll use an example outside of WattPad. Spotify, they talk about increase in usage, but how people are using Spotify changed quite drastically pre and post pandemic. As an example, they are spending a little bit less time on podcasts, but spending much more time on consuming audio content on connected devices. It's starting to make sense, right? Because you spend less time during commute. Commute is the best time to listen to podcasts because you're stuck in the traffic. You have nothing else to do, but you can focus on listening. But at home, you're taking care of the kids, having dinner, or multitasking. It's mostly unfocused time. So and because you're at home, you might tend to use your Apple TV to listen to audio, which I'm doing much more personally as well. So because of the device that you use is different, because of the type of content that you use is going to be different, there might be new form of entertainment that's fully taking advantage of this. Maybe we haven't seen this type of entertainment yet, but I'm pretty sure some of that would be catered to this type of increase or change in user behavior. The second theme is social, which I also touch on. Let's be realistic. I think the virus looks like it's going to be sticking around for a little bit longer. So if we are staying home for much longer and we are not able to invite friends over, how can we maintain that crave for social while all staying at home? I don't think Zoom is the answer. I don't think FaceTime or phone call is Is the answer? Perhaps they are, but I don't think they are the only answer. As an example, the group networking, 50 people, 100 people in a party, that type of environment, almost impossible to recreate on Zoom. I think that's an opening for someone to recreate that environment digitally, as an example. And the third one is the decrease in marketing costs. What I mean by that is because of the recession, and because this recession looks like it's going to last for a long time, because of some permanent damage to the economy. This is of course as just an opinion and an assumption, but if this is right, if the recession is going to last for a little bit longer, then user acquisition costs may be much lower than a few months ago. And because of that, perhaps there's a new way for companies to acquire new users. And lastly, as I would say, the acceleration of this digitization. I think from an entertainment perspective, not saying we are not watching Netflix, but all the time, but even Netflix, the numbers, they are seeing step function growth. And I think for those who are not on streaming already, they are, most of them are kicked over the goal line. And for those who are already past the goal line, guess what? Fewer people are going to theater, fewer people are going to live entertainment or concerts in the foreseeable future. And if that becomes the habit, I think the digitization of live entertainment or other forms of entertainment there may be a new form of entertainment being emerged, or at least increase in consumption. So these are all new behavior that's very different than pre-crisis. And if someone can capitalize on that, as a multi-billion-dollar opportunity.
I think those are some
realistic optimism. Sorry, Chris.
No, I think those are some great insights. And I know that it's reflected in my own behavior, right? In terms of, I got kicked over the goal line and started using streaming video where I didn't before. I felt like I didn't have time, but now I want the comfort. And so I'm using Amazon Prime Video. I always paid for it anyways because I had Amazon Prime. I just never bothered until now. And I find that I use it on separate devices. I have separate devices for each thing. It's easier than actually going from application to application. And similarly, in terms of socialization, I do find that the meetings where there's more of a chance for an actual one-on-one or small group interaction is just so much more powerful than a Zoom with 50 people, which really doesn't work. So I think you're right on. Eli, you were saying.
Yeah, I love the realistic optimism. And I feel like that's what, a lot of people are missing. Chris and I wanted to talk to people that were optimistic. Optimistic could be you're ignoring reality and you're like, well, this thing's going to disappear. The summer's going to start, and we're in the summer, but summer's going to start and it's going to disappear and it's all over and we're going back to work. So that's optimistic. Pessimistic is like, the world is falling apart, we're screwed. But I like how you acknowledge that this is going to be with us for a long time. We're in a recession, but realities are changing in ways that we can benefit, and you have solutions to it. And I love that on the user acquisition cost. Like that's something that I focus on in my own consulting. And some people they're in a state of pause. They're not acquiring customers because they don't know how to do that in the current environment. So they're just waiting till normal comes back. But like you said, if you recognize that things are changed and user acquisition costs are going to be potentially less, you just go to that route and you get your users cheaper rather than just, again, waiting or ignoring. So that's great. And, acknowledging this new reality means you can deal with it. Ignoring it means you're screwed.
Yep.
So one last question for you, Alan, because I know it is late out there in Toronto, and it's quite appropriate since you are the CEO and co-founder of WattPad. You mentioned you got into this because you love reading. What are some of your favorite books? And are there any that you've turned to for inspiration and insight during this time?
There are have to mention we are also getting into traditional publishing as well. So we have our own imprint going to Barnes& Noble or Indigo in Canada. You are able to buy some of our books in the physical bookstores, assuming they're open, right? The two books or stories that I read on WattPad recently, one is called QB Bad Boy. It's a book that we publish. It's a teen romance, kind of embarrassing that I'm not a teen and I'm not, I don't identify myself as female, but you know, I have to eat my own dog food. So I carried the paper book when I was on vacation in Florida during the holiday a few months ago. That's how I spend my time on the beaches. It's actually, I find this extremely entertaining, even though it may not be my genre, but I really, really enjoy that book. The other one that I want to talk about, well, maybe there are two more that
Sure.
I want to talk about. The other one that I'm currently reading is called She's With Me. It's one of the most popular story on WattPad as part of the Page Stories program. Some of our content, if they are getting really popular, we may consider in partnership with the writers, we may want to put it behind the paywall and people can pay chapter by chapter using virtual currency very inexpensively. They can consume the content. But that aside, you know, we are also publishing this, and Sony Pictures optioned this. We might see this on big screen as a TV show pretty soon. So I'm reading that as we speak right now. I really enjoy this book as well. I can understand why people are in love with that. And finally, what I want to talk about is it's another book that on my to read list. I haven't started yet. It's called What Happened That Night. It's a story that's not only we publish, but we also set up a separate fund called Development Fund that we want to fund some screenwriters to adapt some of our amazing content into a screenplay so that we can accelerate the process for adaptation for the TV or movies. So that's my next. I heard great review on that one. I'm dying to read that one. And if you have time, it's still available on WattPad. It's available on WattPad, so check it out.
What's the name of that book again? I'll put a link to it in the show notes.
What Happened That Night.
What Happened That Night. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, for those of you who are listening, tune into the show notes and you can follow that link and read it on WattPad.
Yep.
Awesome. Eli and Allen, this has been fantastic. Are there any final thoughts? Anything we failed to ask you that we should have asked you?
I would say perhaps you mentioned Toronto or Canada a few times. Perhaps ask me something about Toronto.
So what is your favorite thing about Toronto that you miss right now because you're not able to go outside?
Yeah, I think the not dissimilar to what I mentioned about Toronto is becoming an amazing tech ecosystem. There are so many companies at scale right now. That's you know, I love to hang out with the founders and the CEOs and other leaders in the company, in other companies, but I can't go out. So this is the part that I'm missing. I wish we can have the chance to share experience amongst our peer groups more during this time, especially, you know, as we discussed, there are a lot of new behaviors. We have to act differently as a leader in the company. We have to be zigging, zagging, be very agile, and having the peer conversation would be super helpful. That's unfortunate. But hopefully, you know, someone is going to create a product that enable this type of conversation much more easily, hopefully. And we, lockdown or not, we don't have to worry about that.
Well, I'm fond of saying.
Sorry, Chris and I met at a Lazaritas event, and they promote Canadian tech companies. So you and I talked before we started the recording about you being in Toronto and coming out to the Valley to meet with your investors. Give us one thing that Toronto has over Silicon Valley from a tech perspective.
Yeah, I think one thing that I do want to highlight, if you look at the population in Toronto, over 51% or just over 50%, I don't know the exact number now, but I think it's still over 50%. 50% of the population born outside of Canada. So if you want to build a global business that's have people who have been very, very immersed, not just in the language, but also culturally immersed in other countries. Toronto is one of the best places in the world to do that, because you can hire people like it's in the neighborhood, it's in the general population. You know, in our company, we have 40% of our employees are people of color. Many of them have lived or born outside of Canada, speak multiple languages, as many as 4, and in one cases, you know, all the major languages that we support in the product, we have at least 1 or 2 employees in the company who can speak that language. So if we need to understand what's going on, you know, we can just ask without that much problem. So there are many things that I can highlight. You know, Waterloo, one of the most amazing schools in the world. Many Valley companies, the #1 school to recruit from is Waterloo. So there are many things that I can highlight, but in terms of international, I think this is one thing very unique about Toronto. Until you've been here or live here, the numbers, they don't tell the whole story.
And I've visited Toronto a number of times. It is a fantastic city. I look forward to visiting again. I just want to thank you so much for being willing to come on and share this kind of realistic optimism. When I speak with you, I think about the fact that I believe human ingenuity is unlimited, and some of the opportunities you've outlined, some of the things you said that people need to do. I hope that the folks who are listening to this, some of them think to themselves, you know what? I'd like to solve that problem. So on behalf of Allen Lau of WattPad, Eli Schwartz, this is Chris Ye, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.